time since I saw you.
Hello my friends, and greetings to you wherever you're at, watching this through some kind of screen, whether your phone, a computer, a television, or probably not a Palm Pilot, but you know, some kind of screen. This is the sermon, and because of the nature of how we're doing church right now through video and this kind of social distancing, let's have some fun with this medium. We can do lots of things through editing, where I could be here, and then I appear here, and seemingly nothing has changed, but that's the power of editing. So let's get into some stuff through this medium. Now, this last week, St. Patrick's Day happened, and if you didn't wear green, you probably got pinched. But do you know why we celebrate St. Patrick's Day? Years and years ago, when Patrick was a young man, he was captured by Irish pirates. So imagine Bono with an eye patch, all right? And they capture him and they take him to Ireland. And when they get to Ireland, he's enslaved at a farm. And he works on this farm for about 6 years. And during this time, a number of things happen. One is that he, working in the fields, begins to develop a way of hearing the voice of God. He begins to hear the Spirit of God working and speaking in his life, and he begins to grow in this hearing of God's voice. And then two, he begins growing in the love for the Celtic people. One night, while he's laying in his bed, he has a dream, and God comes to him and says, I want you to get up, and I want you to walk towards the sea and get on a boat and go home. And so he gets up, and he sneaks out, walks towards the sea, which was like 200 miles away. But he makes his way to the sea, and he gets passage on a ship, and he goes back to Britain. He goes back to school, he graduates, he goes, becomes a priest, and he's a priest for a number of decades. When he's in his late 40s, one night he has a dream. And in his dream, his master, the Celtic master at the farm that he works at, comes to him and comes back to him and says, farm boy, I guess it's an early Princess Bride reference, says, farm boy, I want you to come back and teach us your ways, come back and teach us about the God you know. And so Patrick goes to his superiors and he says, I want to go to Ireland and I want to bring the gospel of Jesus there. Now you gotta understand that at this time in the Catholic Church, Ireland was the least church part of the whole Catholic empire. Do we want to use that word? You know, a conglomerate. And so he goes with about 50 priests, artisans, cooks, farmers, all this group of people, and they make their way to Ireland. And instead of getting off the boat and drawing their swords and going our way or the highway, which has been done lots, they go into this community and they go, the God we want to tell you about is already in your midst. It's already here. And so what they did is they just started pointing out where God was in their midst. And they were like, you know the Shamrock? Oh, hold on. I have lots of clover in my backyard, so we can do this illustration. They would say, hey, you know the Shamrock? The clover? Oh my gosh. What? I just found a 4-leaf clover. Okay, that's not what okay, that's great. How lucky is that? I might send that to you guys. But they would say, I'm really thrown by that, but they would say this Shamrock, you know, the three, that's like the Trinity, like the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And they would point how God was already involved in their community. Patrick and his people were there for about 19 years, and during those 19 years, Ireland went from the least church place in the Catholic conglomerate to the most church place in the Catholic conglomerate. And it was because they pointed out that God was already in their midst, and they helped people see that God was already with them. And one of the ways that they taught people how to pray is they would do this. They would say, imagine you're in your garden. Because everybody back then had a garden. They didn't have, you know, a Safeway or someplace to go. They said, imagine you're in your garden and Jesus and the disciples are there too. And when we say disciple, and we could do this together, imagine you're in your garden. I'm actually here in my backyard, and Jesus and the disciples are there too. And when we say disciples, we mean, yeah, like the 12 men who followed him, but also the women who followed him and supported his ministry. The the men and women who were a broader community of people who were his disciples, and then the women and men who went out to start the church, and women and men throughout the history, Teresa of Avila, Martin Luther King, Thomas Merton, St. Francis, Dorothy Day. All of these people, they're disciples of Jesus. So Jesus and the disciples are there in your garden. He's like, imagine that. What are they talking about? What are they talking about? And this is how they taught people how to pray. What's happening in this situation? What's happening is you're using your imagination. You're using your imagination, and we all have it. And the definition for imagination is this: the faculty or actions of forming images of external objects not present to the senses. And we all have this. Like, we all have this ability. We can imagine, if we bought a piece of property, the house we want to build on it, or you're imagining like the dinner you want to make for your loved ones at home tonight. Right? We all have this capacity. And we've heard a lot about imaginations through Disney and creativity, and some of us said, well, I don't have it because I'm not creative. But what I think spiritually is that what's interesting is that imagination has to do with images, and I have a lot of thoughts on images. So our words are rooted in imagery. Now, when we use our words, we're describing something that we're seeing externally or internally through our language, our symbol set of languages. So when I say she, I'm describing a woman, a person. Was, I'm describing a moment in time. Sweat into the Oldies, one of the greatest franchises ever created by the wonderful man Richard Simmons. And so I'm actually describing something that I'm actually seeing with the words that I use. Now, our beliefs are rooted in words, our sacred texts, which are also rooted in imagery. Now, we don't necessarily think about the images that are inferring or giving definition to our beliefs, but they're there. A lot of us grew up in Protestantism, and we don't really have a robust symbol set or visual vocabulary, so we're not really aware of the images that are informing the words that we use. But they're there. Like, I could just do a simple exercise with you all and just say, imagine heaven. If we could see into each other's brains what we imagine, we would find some very different things, right? But we'd also find some very similar things. And I bet you cold hard cash, send it to me via Venmo or Cash App, that the similarities that we all have about heaven are not given to us by scripture, that's words, but have been given to us by characters and cartoons and movie clips and TV scenes and paintings and all that stuff. There's no biblical precedence for clouds, angel wings, and playing harps, but when I asked some kids not too long ago, describe heaven for me, what they said was like, I don't know, clouds, angel wings, and playing harps. We have these interior images that have been implanted in us, and they're informing our beliefs, the words that we use. Now, I think actually when people, this is a side note, but I would think when people say, I don't believe in this anymore, what they're not saying is, I don't believe the words anymore. What they're saying is, I don't believe the imagery anymore. These images stopped working for me. And you know the images that stopped working for you. I mean, maybe some of them still work. I don't know, does this really still work for you? You know, and there's these images that are happening, and like all of this is made up. Like all of this is illustrated. It's people using their imagination or, you know, their capacity for making images, but none of it's true. None of it's like a picture of reality. It's all just, you know, inferring some narrative or something. And what happens though is that if we don't identify the images that are working in us, they might lead us to become the people that we don't want to be. And I think when people say, I don't believe this anymore, they're like, I don't want to become that kind of person in the world. Surely this whole thing doesn't lead you to become that kind of person. This is important to understand, especially when we're talking about context and how we read the Bible and we put things into context. And let's do a little exercise to understand about these internal images working on how we read Scripture, okay? Okay, so let's take, for example, this, you've probably seen this online or some kind of card. Choose a job you love and you will never work a day in your life. Now, we've all heard this statement, or maybe this is the first time. What are the images that we associate when we hear these words? Well, choose, we are a society of choosing, right? We have lots of options when we go to a grocery store. A job, well, you might have some job you want, which is to be like a famous vlogger or something like that, or a social media influencer, right? Because you never want to work. And when we think about work, we might think of like some like manufacturing job or something that, I don't want to work indoors, right? Because, and when we say never work, we're imagining some vacation, some tropical island or something, and then a day in your life. Well, when I think about the expanse of my life, I might get really old, right? Like all the way up until my 70s and 80s and stuff like that. Now, the thing is that this phrase was written by Confucius, who lived around 500 BC, right? Approximately. So, when he wrote this, things were very different back then. Choose, well, there wasn't a lot of choices for somebody back then. Like, you didn't really move more than 30 miles from the whole area that you lived in. A lot of people were born into a job that their family had done for years and years and years. And so when we think about job, well, what's a job I love? At the time, iron was being invented and molded, and so maybe the job you wanted wasn't being a video vlogger. No, it was working with iron and making iron things. And then work, there was lots of kind of agricultural work, rice farming and mostly farming, right? And so never working might have looked like, at the time there was the early stages of golf and things like that, so maybe that was a leisure activity. And in your life, well, people didn't live to be very old. In fact, they lived as old as I am now. So when we hear these words, we bring all of these visuals to it. Yet when the person was writing it, they might have had all these other images that were associated with it. Now, so for example, because it's such always like a heated passage, or there's lots of things, take Mark 13, and often it says like end times, right? It's like a passage where Jesus points out the temple and like, isn't it beautiful? And he's like, it won't be here one day. And it's like, what? And then people talk and take these words and they're like, yeah, and then he means right now, because in there, he uses all these words like wars and nation against nation and earthquakes, famines, courts, pregnant, false prophets. And we're like, oh, I've heard of wars. I know some nations against nations. I've heard of earthquakes or experienced it. I've heard of famines. I know about courts. I know somebody who's pregnant. I think there's some false prophets, right? And we go, I must be talking about right now. But this was thousands of years ago, and there was plenty of wars, and there was major nations against nations, and there was earthquakes happening in ancient times, and famines all over the place, and they had courts, and they had pregnant peoples, and they had false prophets. So when we read these passages, we have to be very careful to understand the context in which the authors are writing and which they're speaking to, because we can easily infer our own images to the definition of these words. So let's talk about the Lord's Prayer, which is what we're going to cover today. And we're going to cover it in when Jesus talks about it in the book of Matthew, chapter 6. He talks about it in here where he juxtaposes prayer. And he says in Matthew 6, and he's like, when you pray, don't be like the hypocrites, for they love to pray standing in synagogues and on the street corners to be seen by men. I tell you the truth, they have received their reward in full. He's saying there's actually a reward for this very public religious spirituality. He's like, but when you pray, go into your room, close the door, and pray to your Father who is unseen. Then your Father who sees what is done in secret will reward you. So he's saying there's this other reward that happens in a secret conversation, because you can't be a liar. You're honest when you're all by yourself. And then in verse 7 he says, and when you pray, don't keep babbling like pagans, for they think they can be heard because of their many words. Do not be like them, for your Father knows what you need before you ask him. Your Father knows what you need before you ask him. We're in a time where a lot of our knowns are becoming unknown, aren't they? A lot of the ways that everything worked and happened and rhythms and structures aren't working anymore. and falling apart or put on pause, and it's forcing us to enter into unknown stages, unknown places. And there's this anxiety and insecurity about that. And I think where I want us to go to is to really go, what does it mean for God to know us? And before we get to the words of the Lord's Prayer, what does it mean for Jesus to give a preface where he says, your Father in heaven already knows everything you need before you ask? Here's the thing about praying that I think often we get tripped up on, is that we think that praying is getting God's attention, and it's not. Prayer is awakening to the voice and work of God already in your lives. So what happens when we approach God and like trying to get God's attention is that we begin this prayer as ways of like a checklist, like a shopping list of things that we're trying to get through, right? And what we're trying to do, I would say, is to get through this and get God to have us be known, to get God to know our situation, to get God's attention and say, God, in heaven, your name's holy, your kingdom come will be done. Today I need some things. Could you give it to me? Please take care of it. And yeah, I'll forgive, please forgive my wrongdoings, and I'll forgive those who did wrong against me. And lead me not into temptation, because I have a computer and that's scary. And then deliver us from evil, because there's lots of evil people out there, right? And then, so we're trying to get God's attention to go, do you know my situation? Do you know what's happening in my life? And this becomes a vehicle to get God's attention. And Jesus prefaces that in saying, God already knows. God already knows. This is not the scheme to get God to know. God already knows. So then what is this for? This is the verbal practice or reminder into a reality that already exists. Into a reality that already exists. This is the practice to remind yourself that God already knows. And I would say, in what's happening here on this side is in that we've had a way of doing church or religion or faith, whatever we want to call it, and that we have images for what these are. And because of things changing and not being the same, those images are going away or they're not working anymore. And our insecurity is in wondering, does God know what's going on with us? Does God know? And Jesus is saying God does know. So then what are the images we put in to pray this? I think right now a lot of those images are blank. And the season that we're entering into is going into unknown places that God already knows, and gathering the images we're going to put into those places. How is God involved in my life right now, and what images could I start to bring in this category? This message is really personal, not just only in like what's going on with society and our structures and jobs and lots of things. And there are many of you who are work is unknown, and futures are unknown, and health is unknown, and that's very scary things. On a real personal level, my wife and I have been discerning for a while, and we're going to move. We're actually moving from a place we've lived for 8 years, and there's a lot of grief because there's a lot of loss, and there's not a whole lot of knowns in the place that we're going to. In fact, there's a lot of unknowns. I find myself overwhelmed with the unknownness and the scariness of that unknownness. And my prayer, my prayer before I even get to the Lord's Prayer has been, you already know. You already know. You already know. And if the giver of our lives already known, then that place of unknownness doesn't have to be an enemy. It can be a good place. It's part of the mystery of this life unfolding. It's part of the work that God is doing in your life right now. And so we can take this scariness of the unknown and we can take, God, you already know. And I'm gonna trust you as I go into this unknownness. As we go forward into unknown places, may our faith be in the God, the giver, the lover of our lives, who already knows everything we need. And as we go into the unknownness, we will go with knowing that love, God is with us and knows us and is already there in that unknown place. Grace and peace to you and blessings in your day.